I'd like to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. This is really an official meeting of our single-family dwelling conversion task force. But there are a lot of guests here tonight, but wanted to start as close to 4 o'clock as we could. I'm Frank Dara. I'm on the City Council, and I chaired this group a year ago. In a minute, I'm going to ask task force members to introduce themselves. We're also passing around the sign-up sheet so we know who's here. And in the back of the room, there's a comment form. So if you don't have one, you may want to get one, so as we're going through the meeting, you can write down your comments. Before I do introduce the task force, I'll just let you know that staff is going to do a presentation of the ordinance as we've implemented it for the last 6 or 7 months. They'll give an overview of that and share with you some data, and then identify some modest changes that they've made in the ordinance. Our purpose tonight is to update the task force, but to also get written feedback from task force members and other people in the group tonight. Next week on Thursday the 19th at 5:30 at the Public Works building on Technology Parkway out in the Industrial Park will be a meeting presenting this to the City Council and a larger audience, more of a public meeting. Again, at that point, the written input that we get from this group tonight will be blended into the presentation to the council. It's my understanding staff will take that additional information and make the final tweaks on the ordinance to ultimately be presented to the council at some later date. That could be a couple months before all of that information is put together. But then there would be, it's my understanding, 3 public readings for final approval of the ordinance. So again, tonight's purpose is to just get that information to the task force and get feedback one more time from the task force. You're welcome to make comments, but we really aren't in a dialogue mode at this point. We just want, if you have a comment, to make it, but counterpoint isn't really the purpose of tonight's meeting. So your comments will be recorded if you want them recorded on the form and turned in to Stephanie at the end of the meeting. That being said, I would like anyone that participated as a task force member for, what was it, 8 or 9 long months working on this, to raise your hand and identify yourselves. Who are you? Who are you? Let's start with Glenn.
Glenn Gray, Assistant Vice President, UNI. Sorry, just had some minor surgery. Glenn Gray, Assistant Vice President at UNI.
Fred Abraham, I'm at UNI as well.
Kate Dunning, Talk to Me Technologies.
This is a test to see who I remember.
Chris Warnemont, landlord.
Right behind you, the next 2 guys right behind you.
Bruce Wingert, landlord and realtor.
And Glenn,
Gail Bonsall, landlord and realtor.
Did I miss anybody?
and several staff people. But with that, since Stephanie's already standing up, I'm going to turn it over to her, and she'll walk through the ordinance and the data with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. All right, as Frank mentioned, there are a lot of different things that I'd like to go through before getting into just talking about the rental ordinance changes. I'd like to ask you to humor me a bit, and I'd like to go through a little bit more history and also talk a little bit about some of the data that we have, like Frank mentioned. So this presentation is an overview of our multi-tier approach that we took to addressing concerns about level of occupancy. It's also a review of the key changes to the ordinance that happened in February and March timeframe, just as a refresher for anybody who may not remember that far back or have dealt in it as much as staff has dealt with it over the past couple months. Giving you some data, like we said, about we had a variety of questions that were asked during the adoption phase, and we tried to collect data related to that as well as any other questions that we heard. So we'll give you as much as we can on that front. And then finally, moving into staff recommendations based on the comments that we received and what we tracked as some challenges, and tried to think about what would be changes that would improve the ordinance. So this meeting is occurring because council, when they adopted the ordinance back in February, said we would like to have a review at the 6-month stage and at the 1-year stage. We know that what we're adopting is a compromise solution, and we want to be monitoring its effectiveness and thinking about, I think as Frank has phrased it, unintended consequences and whether there are some things that we would need to adjust at this point. And so that's what we have been doing. As Frank mentioned, it's really going to be geared toward how do we improve the ordinance, how do we make it clearer based on observations that we've had or concerns that we've heard. So those are the areas that I'm going to be focusing when I talk about the recommendations. Moving into the approach that we took, many of you are probably aware that there was kind of really a 5-prong approach, I call it, to the activities that we put in place. In August of 2014, the city really stepped up doing proactive code enforcement, and I'll talk about each one of these a little bit more. Also then, what many of you know are the rental ordinance and the zoning ordinance changes that occurred in February and March of 2015. And then some things that are on the horizon yet are to council adopted in the budget for this year incentive program. So we are working on that, and we've given a presentation once to council and had some comments on that, and we're working to address those and be back in front of the council with a proposed program. And then nuisance ordinance changes to help with the effectiveness of some of our nuisance-related issues. That is moving forward, and actually at council committee on Monday night, November 16th, we'll be talking about what those recommendations are. Just to give you an example, because I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the nuisance ordinance, one area where we have noticed that we've had multiple concerns and we have inefficiencies on our side is related to how we work with nuisance complaints on grass height. So grass at 12 inches is considered a nuisance. Before that point, even if somebody doesn't like how long their neighbor's grass is, there's really nothing that we can do about it. So if we get the complaint that it's 12 inches, we'll go out and verify that. If it is, then we contact the property owner about that and ask them to remedy that situation and address it. And they have 7 days from the time we issue that notice to address it. Let's say it doesn't get done for whatever reason. We have properties in foreclosure, for example, so those get to be difficult ones about who actually got the notice and is something being done. Then before we can go in and do anything, we have to serve another notice. We need to send another mailing. That means we have to go check it to verify whether it was done or not before a mailing goes out. So really, before the city can do anything to address a situation that maybe we received a complaint about, it's another 2.5 to 3 weeks. And depending on the time of year, 12 inches can grow even more. So the proposal is in the nuisance to adjust that to an 8-inch height at that point that it becomes a nuisance, and then there's 1 notice. So that means that maybe, depending again on the time of year, it might be 12 inches by the time we're able to go do something about it. So that's just an example of one of the nuisance areas that we'll be addressing. I want to go over the activity level with code enforcement. Like I said, kind of going through each of these points a little bit. When we increased and started to do more proactive, some people have said aggressive. Really, I think the point is about noticing what our opportunities are to do more. And so systematic monitoring is one area where we have really focused. Some of you may have heard us talk about a grid inspection where we're going area by area, and we indicated that that will take about 5 to 7 years to hit every area of town by doing a monitoring visit. So far we've touched almost 2,000 properties in that systematic monitoring. We also have continued to take issues by complaint. That used to be the only way that we dealt with code enforcement, and we've had just over 350 complaints that we have received in that same time period of starting the systematic monitoring. So this is about August 1 till probably October-ish, I believe. And then rental inspections was another area where we identified, hey, we've already got an inspector going out there every 3 years visiting a property, and that is also a time that we're not only looking at the safety and verifying that on the interior, but since we're at the property, we can do the exterior inspection. What's the maintenance level? Is it painted? Does anything need to be taken care of in terms of trimming bushes or whatnot? So that adds almost another 1,000 to that activity level. In total, then, out of all of that activity, we've had about 12,000 violations that 1,200. I always do that. Violations. So really, I think we're doing pretty good, and I'll report just a little bit more on that. Some of you might be familiar that you've seen this kind of table in front of council. Every month, Jeff Olson and I were doing updates to the council on the code enforcement activity level, and we tried to give the month time frame of what we reported before, for example, here in September, to then where it is in October. And this is a cumulative number, so in that time frame, you had about 12 more building maintenance items, and we tried to indicate what were some of those common things that we were noticing. We did the same thing, So then to review that, the latest thing that we did when we reported to council in October was, okay, out of all that number of inspection level, how are we doing on addressing those issues? So this here, from August of 14 to May of 2015, we re-inspected 198 cases, and out of those, 56% had completed whatever it was that they needed to address. Then another 29% were in progress. And really, starting that progress is what we were aiming for. The approach when we started proactive code enforcement was, give us a plan. Within 14 days, please communicate with us how you're going to address it, how and when. And for something like putting on a new roof, obviously, that costs a lot of money, that needs more time. If it's, trim a bush, that can be done in a week. So we're really trying to accommodate what the scale of the issue would be, as well as how many. So we had 29% that were in progress, and then 15% where nothing had been done. So at this point, we've been back in touch with those 30 properties, asking them to update us on their plan. Do they want to modify that, or just at least be in touch with us? Give them another opportunity to give us a time frame of when it will be addressed, and hopefully it gets done and we leave it at that. If not, we move into citations on those issues. Also, I wanted to give you this table that council's also seen every month about nuisance-related items, which then you see the top items here are snow and ice, trash issues, and grass. So that's maybe an example of why we would focus on the length of the grass, is because those are one of our top issues. Moving on. So now I'd like to give an overview of what were those changes that were adopted in February of 2015. Before summarizing those changes, as many of you know, here on the task force, you had multiple discussions for months and months, very thoughtful discussion, sometimes heated debate, and I just caught the tail end of that, so you could probably tell me a lot more about what happened there. But then in early November, we were in front of council and the Planning and Zoning Commission talking about what the recommendations were, and then I believe it was late December, early January, an ordinance was moving forward and adopted by February. The whole concept of the ordinance that was proposed and adopted was to base rentals and occupancy level in particular on the carrying capacity of the structure, of the lot, the street, and the neighborhood. So really weighing all of those factors and thinking about how they work together. These changes were a compromise. We've talked about that over and over, and the point was to try to start addressing impacts of higher occupancy, yet also try to maintain the investment and the business plan that some of our landlords have when they've gone into a property. So it's a tough balancing act to do all of that, and it certainly hasn't been without its challenges. To go over some of those, and I'll go over a little bit more in detail, but the highlights that I like to give about the ordinance when I talk to people is that if it's a registered rental, and that is prior to the moratorium date of August 19th, 2014, then it can remain with 4 unrelated until the time that it's sold or transferred. If it's a new rental, anything after that magic date, your guaranteed occupancy level is for a family or 2 unrelated persons. If you want to go beyond that to anywhere from 3 to 5, then you go into the group rental committee, and there's a review process for that, and I'll talk about that just a bit more. We changed the family definition. We also implemented a requirement for rentals to have hard surfaces, and that any deviations from that go to a staff review, like I mentioned, and also then there's yet another level, which is not uncommon among in our zoning type of aspects, that if you want to appeal or want additional review, then we are utilizing the Board of Rental Housing Appeals for that. So going over the family definition, many of you are probably aware, you like my Brady Bunch picture here. That's really what we were maybe trying to reflect here. So we have kind of an involved definition there that then goes into some tiers. And on items A and B, for example, where we talk about any number of related persons or 2 unrelated persons and their dependent children, we also have the opportunity that there might be a situation of a live-in nanny, or maybe they want to host an exchange student, or those types of things. We certainly want to accommodate that. That's certainly something that should be encouraged. And so this definition works to reflect that, as well as reflect how groups of unrelated need to be considered with a little bit more scrutiny. On an existing rental, as I mentioned, it remains at the 4 unrelated persons until the point that there's a transfer in the ownership. And at that point, there's an evaluation. And the first tier of that evaluation is, well, if you meet all 4 of these criteria, that lot width equal or greater to 70 feet, lot area greater than 8,000 square feet, the street width being greater than 31, and then having 4 off-street parking spaces, you can remain guaranteed at 4 unrelated. If the property is a situation where it does not meet all 4 of those, you automatically are reduced to 3 unrelated persons. And then, like I said, with all of these processes, there's an appeal option there, and in this case, it goes forward to the Board of Rental Housing Appeals. Now, out of that, I just wanted to give you, well, I'll pause and I'll give you some data in a little bit, just going over the ordinance a little bit more. We also had a mandatory filing portion of the ordinance, and that was related to single-family and duplex properties. And the reason for that was to gather some of the data that people were asking for that I'll be able to go over in a little bit. We did a lot of different outreach to try to make sure that that word was out, because the goal was not to be sly about it. We wanted everybody to know you need to get your information in. So a letter went out to all rental properties right after the ordinance was adopted. We put information on our website and a link to the form. We had a currents article in the spring of 2015. There have been landlord workshops where we've mentioned it. Postcard reminder went out in July of 2015. And then a second reminder went out in September to all of those that we hadn't heard from at that point. And then a final letter has gone out at the end of October, letting those remaining properties, which at this point we have 19, have now lost their rental status because they did not provide that form to us. And so if they want to be a rental, they need to meet the new requirements. Related to new rentals, as I said, new rentals are guaranteed at an occupancy level of a family or 2 unrelated. And this was really tailored to single-family dwelling units, and we have a variety of zoning districts identified here. So what we tried to be clear about when the ordinance was adopted was there was not an intent to touch the example of an apartment building that's clearly been planned for multifamily, for higher occupancy, has the parking in place, for example, that type of thing. So it was really about the single-family unit that's converted to a rental and what's appropriate in terms of level of occupancy for those types of properties. Then the process is, if you're interested in having anywhere from 3 to 5 unrelated persons in that unit, then you go into the group rental review, which I'll touch on in just a minute. And finally, if the level of occupancy you're requesting happened to be denied by that committee, you could go forward to the Board of Rental Housing Appeals and request consideration. The criteria that the committee, which is a staff committee, that staff committee includes the fire chief, myself as a city planner, and the building official. These are the 7 criteria that we're looking at. All of our staff reports have each of these sections as a header, and we're thinking about each one of those and trying to bring information to the table on that. And in a little bit, I will present a little bit of information about some of those new rentals that have gone through the process, because I know that that's been a question for people. So that's an overview of and highlights of the ordinance that was adopted. What I'd like to move into now was some of the questions that we had as it was going through the adoption phase, and perhaps even some that we heard afterwards. And here's a list of questions, and I'm going to go through each one of these, so I don't want you to feel that you have to read it real quickly, and I'm not going to say each one right now because I will step through each of these. The only one that I will not be stepping through is the question that we had about the occupancy level of our existing units. That was a piece of information that we tried to collect through that filing that I talked about, but many of you may be aware or expressed concern to us about the requirement to provide the lease. And so we backed off that requirement. It's a private contract, and so we have inconsistent data on this. And so we are going to, as we're going around and doing inspections of the rentals, we will ask what the occupancy level is at that time to gradually collect this information over time. Of course, that will just be a snapshot at that particular point in time, because we just went through occupancy level and how that would work and how an existing registered one is guaranteed the 4 unrelated, even if at this point in time you had 3, for example. So going through the various data. First question is, how many units do we have out there and how many are converting every year? So we have just over 1,300 single-family and duplex rental units, and here's kind of a 5-year history of the numbers of rental conversions that we've seen. And obviously, the 2015 data is not a full year yet, but what we had been seeing, if I understand what was reported to the task force at one point, was that on average we were seeing about 10 new rentals a month, and that still seemed to be occurring. Maybe 1 month a little bit less, maybe 1 month a little bit more. But if we use that number, you'd see that 2015 could be on track with 2012 or 13, if that holds true. How many have reduced in occupancy since the ordinance has been passed? These are approximate numbers. The first one is known. We had an appeal when a property was sold that went forward to the Board of Rental Housing Appeals, and it was denied. They have reviewed 4 cases to this point. And then we know of probably around 6, and again, that's an approximate number because we have not tracked this one as well. We've been focused on the new rentals and collecting that data. But I do, either myself or David or Iris have talked with people who have asked, I'm planning to sell, and so this is an approximate number, and we know of a couple that have expired and got kicked into having to meet the new rental ordinance. So there are a couple cases out there, but it hasn't been, a ton of them, I would say. Out of the new rentals, this is the data on the numbers that we've seen, and Group Rental Committee only reviews when it's a request for 3 or more unrelated. So when I said about 10 a month just a little while ago, we certainly have had applications come through asking for family or 2 unrelated, and they go straight into the rental inspection just like any rental used to do. It's only when you're asking for 3 or more that you go into the Group Rental Committee review process. So we've had a total of 24 since February, or I guess probably March, beginning of March. Out of that, I wanted to share with you a little bit about what the requests have been for occupancy level. And I give you here 2 numbers. One is the requests that we received, but then what was actually approved. Because not in all cases was that request approved at the level that it was requested. Now, every rental request that's come through the committee has been approved, just not necessarily at the level that was requested. So for example, we had 16 requests for 4 unrelated, and the committee approved 12 of those. And so in that case, then the other 4 likely went to either 3 unrelated or family. So that's a little bit of background there. Now, another data-related question that we heard a lot as the ordinance was being adopted and as it was being discussed was the impact to home sales and the price of home sales. And so we got some information from the county about the home sales over the period of February through August, and actually our August numbers just went through August 1st, so I decided just to report full months, so full months of February through July, for 2014 and 2015. And then what's been added there is the number of homes in that time period that's sold. In all of this, I see some people writing down, there is a handout there of the presentation, so you can have those numbers if you'd like. And I thought, I'd let you draw your own conclusions about what this information means. You see that it's a little varied, but it's interesting to look at. Other things about impact to sale price and rental rates. Well, there's a lot of different factors that impact a sale rate or a rental rate. Sure, local government regulations are one of them, but there are a variety of other impacts too. So it's very hard to say that any one of these is the key factor. I think that several of them probably end up working together. And we had some John Deere announcements on layoffs during the period that we've been enacting this ordinance and observing it. So we certainly have that impact to recognize there. So it's very difficult when the question came up about how does this impact rental rates. That's a very difficult one for us to answer. But what we can do is tell you what's happened to home sales and tell you what we know about those things that impact price. Another question related to the gravel is how many situations of gravel do we have out there? How big of an issue or concern might this be? And again, from the filing form that we requested, we asked people to indicate, do you have gravel or paved surface, and what's the dimensions, to get an understanding there. And so 26% of those indicated that they have gravel, and 74% indicated they have a paved surface. Now this then does not count the multifamily type of situations or multiple units that are in a home, for example, that have the gravel parking lot, for example, behind them. This is really just the single family units, the one house with one unit in it, or a duplex, because those were the only properties that had to file this information. So that's going over a lot of the different questions that we heard and trying to give you information about those. Now I'm going to move into evaluation of the changes and talk a little bit through some of the things that we've observed and then move into staff recommendations from there. So there are a couple key points that I want to talk about. One, in terms of proactive code enforcement. The code enforcement efforts are going to improve all properties in the city. It has not been targeting a certain type of use or a certain occupancy level. We have contacted commercial properties that have had to do some maintenance. We've also contacted owner-occupied homes, as many of you know. So it was not just targeting rental homes. It's for the entire community because the value of property is a community-wide benefit, and when the property is well-maintained, everybody benefits from that. The occupancy level review is working. I think that people have settled into it to some degree. Some may disagree with that, but we continue to hear concerns about that. We continue to hear concern about impact to sale. I've talked with a variety of realtors who have indicated, when they want 3 or 4 unrelated people in this unit, they have to get the group rental permit. And so they're doing an offer contingent on that, for example, contingent on that approval. And so that house has to go off the market. And so then you have the period of the 2 to 3 weeks to get through that review process. And let's say it wasn't approved at the level of occupancy that that investor wanted. So they might back out of the offer, and then that home goes back on the market. And the realtors say, now that seller is dealing with questions from investment market or from other potential owners. What's wrong with that property? Why did it go off the market, come back on, and maybe I'll stay away from that one. So we've heard that a couple times. We've also heard from the investor perspective concern about the risk. And well, I don't know if I want to make an offer on that because I don't know what kind of occupancy I would get. Now, we've had many people ask us for some preliminary information. Hey, where do you think this would fall? We're very happy to give that. But of course, it's the group rental committee that makes the final decision there. And if you're not happy with that, you appeal that. So that risk, as well as the time involved, that 2 to 3 week period, is something that some people are a little leery about. Paving is a concern. I know some of you in this room have talked to me about that, and we'll get into that in just a minute. The amount of parking, we've heard that as a concern. One of the changes in the ordinance that I guess I didn't highlight it because it was in the zoning ordinance, one of the changes we made in March was that for rentals, the parking amount would be determined by the number of bedrooms in the unit. Our ordinance prior to that change said any unit needs to have 2 parking spaces per unit. That's been the standard for a long time, probably since 1971, I would guess. But that change in March to the zoning ordinance said and so it applies then, how zoning ordinances are applied is that anything from that point forward needs to meet the new ordinance in place. And other ones we assume are legal, non-conforming, we call them, or in other words, some people say grandfathered. Then dimension and setback of the driveway flare out, and I'll get into this because it's gets just a little complicated. We adopted in our zoning ordinance some provisions where you could widen a driveway. Actually, those are new provisions because we had nothing in our ordinance before. So if somebody called and said, hey, I want to add on to the side here, which you see in a lot of places, if they called to ask about that, we told them no, our ordinance did not allow that. So we actually implemented some allowances to do that, yet we've seen some challenges, some of the dimensions that we identified, and I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. So going through recommendations, I'm going to split this up into going through the rental ordinance recommendations, then zoning ordinance, and then finally just a couple miscellaneous type of things, which is kind of how the tracking of the comments is also organized. So also, I guess I did want to say, again, reiterate that the focus here was, sure, we had a lot of different comments to sift through and observations, so we're looking at those comments that help with the goal of adding clarity to the ordinance that we've adopted. And how do we deal with some of the concerns that I just went over in terms of evaluation. So the first item in terms of occupancy level, the concern about that review, as I kind of went over already, the realtor perspective, the seller perspective, the buyer perspective, investor, and that added time, the unpredictability, the concern about that, and maybe even lack of clarity about what would I get here, is something that people have struggled with. And so going to a recommendation of rather than add that time and that concern and that struggle, just a flat 3 unrelated persons for a new rental. And at the time that existing registered rental that currently is at 4 unrelated would be sold or transferred, that is when the occupancy would reduce to 3. The occupancy level when a property undergoes interfamilial transfer. So we've had multiple comments about this asking, hey, if I want to sell it to my son or daughter, hey, they've been managing the property for years, and technically I might have an impact occupancy level if I do that under the ordinance right now. There's a desire to recognize that type of arrangement is a little different and perhaps should be recognized and allowed, that in that transfer it could maintain 4. But if it was what I've called an organizational change, for example, we've had some properties where they want to move from 2 individuals to an LLC, for example. If that move into an LLC added a person or 2 or 3, or the LLC changed in adding people, that would trigger the reduction in occupancy. Copy of the lease, that was a point of a lot of concern, being a private contract, and so we'll propose to remove that provision from the ordinance. And finally, hard surface, a lot of concern over removal of gravel. And that proposal is to leave it as is, and I'm going to go into some of the reasons why in my next couple slides. I would say that also what I've heard, and because I have met with a lot of people on this, I've gone out to properties and talked with them, and I hear a lot of the concern being from the rentals where it's a single-family home and they have gravel because that has been permitted. And why should that be treated the same way as a parking lot, where a parking lot has always had to be paved, and so we're triggering that change that those parking lots that are gravel out there need to be paved. So there's been concern about why a driveway gets treated like a parking lot. Why the focus on the gravel? There were points that we talked about when it was adopted, but I'd like to go over those because they are important, and this is a concern for a lot of people. Gravel lots that, as I already mentioned, the gravel lots that have 3 or more parking spaces have already been required to be paved. They should have been paved already. There should not be gravel there that expands that to 4 or 5, as this picture shows, almost 6 vehicles there, and then even parking in the mud. So those need to be addressed, and we adopted a provision that allows a time frame for that versus the immediate. You could take the hard line and say, hey, those were always required to be paved, they need to be paved today. But we decided that it was appropriate to give some time to plan for that investment and that expense, and over the next 3 to 6 years is how that will be addressed. So any inspection, a rental inspection that happened after the February adoption of the new ordinance was given their 3-year notice, and since it's a 3-year cycle, that's why it's the 3 to 6 year time frame. Another reason as to why pave, rentals could be considered commercial, and we require any commercial business to have a paved surface. Rentals tend to have a higher level of vehicles coming and going that lends to more wear and tear on that gravel surface, and so that becomes much more pronounced much quicker. So that's another reason to pave it. And then finally, as the picture, one of the pictures that I showed on the slide there shows, gravel tends to expand. And I'm going to put a little bit more down, and before you know it, it's right at the property line, and we've had a requirement for quite some time that parking lots need to be 5 feet off of a property line. So we needed to add definition to the width of a driveway to make sure that a driveway doesn't turn into a parking lot, and we needed to add definition to parking lots that they're paved so that those encroachments don't occur, and so we observe those setback buffers. A couple other points about why gravel. Gravel washes away or it's cleared away with snow removal, and so then it eventually makes its way into our storm sewers and into our streams, has pollutants attached to it, or maybe clogs our sewer system. And as you see a lot of information in the paper about EPA mandates on clean water, and there are a lot of different things that we need to be doing in order to accomplish this, and this is one of the things that we can do, is to avoid that gravel washing off into our streams and into our sewers. And then finally, any new home, whether it's owner-occupied or rental now, must be paved. The driveway must be paved. So really what ends up happening is there are the existing owner-occupied situations where they might have gravel because that's what was allowed. Those remain until a change is proposed. When they want to expand that driveway, which we'll get into in a little bit, that section will have to be paved. So they cannot expand it with gravel, for example, because they've got gravel. So gravel eventually becomes much less predominant in the community. Moving on to zoning ordinance changes. Related to driveways, we adopted a lot of criteria about dimensions of driveways. Again, like I said, wanting to be sure that they act as driveways, they provide access to the garage, and are used as such. So, but we have had some experiences here that gave us pause to think about how it works and how it doesn't work, and what we should propose. So I'll show you a picture of what a side extension is in just a little bit, and some of you have picked up the pamphlet, I think. But these are the expansions to a driveway. We defined a driveway as being the width of the garage. And so if you've got a 2-car garage, you have a 2-car wide driveway. If you have a 1-car garage, it's 1 car wide. And then outside of that, you can have these expansions. The site extension is along the side of the garage, for example, typically where you see a camper parked or a boat or that kind of thing, and you see it around town. And we establish a 10-foot maximum on that width. And we've had people say, you know, my camper's taller, you know, they usually are. I've got my eave on my garage, and I can't fit it in that 10 feet. I don't want to hit the garage. I say, well, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's widen that to 12 feet. So that's what we're proposing here, so that we can accommodate and have that maneuverability and avoid accidents. The length of the flare-out, and I'll have a slide in a little bit that will go through this in more detail and give you a graphic so you better understand that, but we identified that expansion to that driveway called the flare-out would be 20 feet in length, and that was based off of a typical residential parking stall is 18 feet long. A commercial parking stall is 19, so 20 seemed like we were giving a little bit of wiggle room there. We've since found out that, well, there's some people that have seen challenges in the flexibility with that and seen that it's kind of tight to fit my truck in there with the extended cab or my van or whatever. So that was very reasonable. So we've actually kind of started putting this into practice, going out on a limb a little bit on the interpretation here and said, hey, you know what, 25 feet seems much more reasonable. And then I'll go over what the taper of the 1-to-1 ratio means in the next slide. Allowing a replacement to match the original. This is a difficult one because there are situations out there where there were expansions to driveways, like I said, that weren't technically permitted under the ordinance that was in place, yet they occurred. They occurred because we didn't have a land use permit, so we weren't reviewing that for compliance with the zoning ordinance. That has been corrected. Any driveway coming through or expansion, parking lot is going through a land use permit at this point to verify that it meets the zoning ordinance. But so then that gets us into a difficult situation of a owner or a rental property saying, hey, I had this and now it's being taken away from me in some respect. Where we've seen the most difficulty with that, and I'll have another slide on this, is the one-car garage situation. And so I'll have that point up there in a little bit and go through that a little bit more thoroughly. Then last, I touched on this just a little bit before about parking amount. And the concern, we've had conflicting concerns on this. I don't know if any of you have observed some of the committee meetings where we gave updates, but we did have at least one property owner get up and say, hey, you know, that rental, I think that the parking should be met when the lease changes. That's a pretty tough one. Then we've had landlords say, hey, you know, my rental, I'm concerned that I can't meet the parking requirement, and so that impact, we've seen that both ways on that concern. So as I indicated when I talked about how zoning ordinance is typically implemented, anything that is new from the time that the new regulations are in place are the ones that have to meet that new regulation. Anything in place prior to that, assuming it's a legal non-conforming situation, is allowed to remain as is until there's a change. So we're not looking to reduce occupancy, for example, because all the parking's not there when you pave it. For example, I think that some people have had that concern, oh, when I pave it, I'm gonna lose a space, and then I'm gonna lose occupancy. That's not the focus. The focus is on getting the gravel paved and at sale or transfer, you know, looking at that occupancy. So going into detail about the length of that flare out, here's a real life situation of an expansion to a driveway that was in place, and the owner came through and wanted to replace that. And the picture then next to that shows what our ordinance at the time with the 20 foot and then allowing additional 5 feet for that taper area resulted in. And that's tough. It creates a pretty severe angle there. You could see as you're trying to get your vehicle into that spot, you might hit the corner, maybe run over grass, and that's not really what we want either. And so and we've had contractors that talk to us about this as well. So in having that experience, we've modified that, and we're currently, we would like to adopt what we're really currently implementing is allowing a length of 25 feet. And then depending on the width of that flare out, that 1-to-1 taper ratio. So I circled that 10 feet on the taper being proportional to the 10 foot in width If it's an 8-foot wide flare out, then it's an 8-foot additional length beyond the 25, for example. So you get that 45-degree angle, a little bit less severe, hopefully not hitting the grass or anything in trying to access that area. Driveway examples, as I mentioned, I was going to go into this just a little bit more about the replacement and really the situation here that's depicted about a one-car garage and how both of these driveways, just right next to each other, have been expanded. And we've had in place for a long time a requirement, again, since 1971, as far as I can tell, the 3-foot setback requirement for any driveway needs to be 3 feet off the property line. So clearly, there's a concern here about that being met. And again, since we didn't require permits, that type of activity wasn't being monitored, whereas it is now. So in this situation, because of the narrow lot, they also really don't have much opportunity to do the side extension because doing that flare out or that side extension along a garage, you need to have your side yard setback met. And in this case, the houses are right at their side yard setback. So this is where we would propose allowing a little bit of an expansion of what we adopted, loosening it just a bit in the case of a one-car garage, allowing a driveway to be wider because it certainly is reasonable that people have at least 2 vehicles and want to park them side by side even if they have a one-car garage. So we want to accommodate that. We think that that's reasonable, and we'd like to move forward with a recommendation that would say, you know, if you've got the case of a one-car wide garage where your driveway then might be 11, 12 feet, allow it to be a maximum of 18 feet wide, so long as that 3-foot setback is met. And then, like I mentioned, leaving the parking amount for rentals the way it is. And that is based on number of bedrooms. It's not based on occupancy. So certainly we've had situations where 4 unrelated might be requested and they only have 3 parking spots because it's a 3-bedroom and one of the bedrooms will be shared. Well, it's a parking ratio based on number of bedrooms, not number of occupants. Then a couple other, I'm sorry, I wanted to highlight that side extension area in case you didn't already get it. The area outlined in the red dotted line is the flare out first, and then behind that alongside the garage is that side yard extension. And then to just demonstrate that side yard setback area is in green. Then a couple other clarifications and adjustments that we've identified. Again, all of those are on the list. One is related to the landlord accountability ordinance. We've experienced difficulty with the quorum, and the reason for that has been because the board was set up to require 5 members and that all 5 or their alternate had to be present. And that was, there was good reason for that, to ensure appropriate representation by all parties, yet sometimes that can be difficult to get that quorum, especially in the summer, even getting alternates there and that kind of thing. So we weren't always able to have some of the meetings that we recently had with them as quickly as we would have liked. And so we thought it appropriate, and council's actually agreed, this is a change that's actually moved forward, is to say, hey, let's operate like any other board or commission where we have 7 or 9 members, in this case 7, and we seek a balanced representation of landlords, being landlords of a single unit to multi-family type of unit, a balance of renters, student renter, non-student renter, as well as community members. So that's the balance that's sought in that membership. It was also suggested that perhaps the points awarded for over-occupancy, if in fact a unit is over-occupied, that those be increased. And we're recommending to just leave it the way it is because we are issuing citations to all occupants if over-occupancy is found to be present. And also to the landlord if we can prove that the landlord knew about it. In terms of rental ordinance definitions, this is a very minor cleanup, but helps with definitions and how we apply those. And the proposal is that the use of the word unit after dwelling unit in the rental ordinance be modified by removing the unit term, and then it be consistent with how we define in the zoning ordinance as well. So just some consistency there. And finally, another note of consistency is that we modified the zoning ordinance so that parking lots would not be in front of a house, and we want to add that clarity to the parking areas. Parking areas have been defined as 2 parking spaces, parking lot is 3 or more. So that quickly goes over a lot of information for you. I'd like to open it up for questions at this point. As Frank said, we've got comment forms in the back, so if you simply want to submit a comment that way, you're free to do so. If you want to share a comment verbally, we will try to write down the gist of what your comment is. And we'd ask that you speak in the microphone, and Bob will try to go around and hit anybody who's interested in speaking and bring the microphone to you. So again, this is about talking about how we add clarity to the ordinance and improve what we have. We're not looking to debate the philosophy of what the council adopted, although we're certainly happy to pass on those comments to the council. So with that, are there questions or clarifications that people want to go over? I moved through a lot, so yes. Well, hold on, Chris. We'll get the microphone to you.
I'm curious about the complaints, not to be paranoid, but do we have a chance to find out who complained exactly? Let's say somebody complained about a property for whatever reason. Do you get to know who is it? If it was a private citizen, who is it that's complaining?
Complaints are handled anonymously. We have some people that have fear of retribution. But I guess in the concern, sometimes we have a concern about, am I going to be hassled over the complaint? I think we as staff try our best to understand both perspectives, learn what's happening, and investigate whether there's actually a violation or not. So that's where we are kind of the mediator of what occurs. Going back to Gail, it reaches, yep.
I just had a question on the ordinance review on 3 unrelated persons on a new rental, dropping to 3. So is that across the board? If I have a 4-bedroom home, 3-stall garage, still it'll cap it at 3?
Yes. Yeah, no review process anymore. It goes through the typical rental process. There is going to be a zoning review just to ensure that the lot size and the parking is met. But if it's a 4-bedroom, the proposal is any new rental is at 3 unrelated persons.
Currently, it's 3 to 5, and there's a whole lot of guidelines and
Yeah.
across the board.
Any other questions or? Well, again, one reason we wanted to be in front of the task force was because of your involvement with the whole process, and wanted to make sure that we gave you the courtesy of hearing some of the changes that are proposed, and that if we heard anything that really would help us in this perspective of what the recommendations are, that we would have some time to consider making that adjustment prior to the full public meeting, which again, I'll just repeat it, is on Thursday, November 19th at 5:30 at Public Works on Technology Parkway. Yes, Chris. Bob just sat down. We'll get you. There we go.
With review today, I think I talked to Dave earlier today about it, but as far as the driveways go, if you have a driveway in the back, let's see where an alley's at, if you only give us 3 years, I know the city is going and paving some of its alleys. Well, let's say that's 5 years out. I guess for a landlord, I run the risk of paying up to $12,000, $15,000 sometimes to pave a parking lot, and then you come in and redo the alley. If there's a lip there, now I'm in a position where I'm gonna have to fix that. Is there any way that possibly you could have where we wouldn't have to pave that until the alley is already taken care of? That way I can go up to the alley and be at the exact same level.
I think there are a couple things to say about that. One, any street project where we have multiple driveways, we deal with matching those grades and accommodating that. So we certainly would envision that alleys are going to function similarly, and we'll have to make those considerations and work on that in the design phase. The second part of that is, I had somebody on University Avenue talk to me about a rental property that they have there, and it's gravel, and they said, when does my time frame come up for when I have to pave it? And it would be right when University Avenue is going on, so or right before, I think it was. And he said, you know what? We're going to work with you, especially since you're asking in advance, you're trying to prepare and plan for it. Certainly makes sense that perhaps we would have some consideration that we get something in writing, within a year of completing the project, or I'd like to try to add that on, and I'm going to approach the contractor while they're there about doing my property. Those might be options. So we just really want to have that communication in advance if there's a request for consideration. The other thing that we're going to try to look at is spend a little bit of time looking at our program for alleys in the upcoming years and try to compare that to rentals that might be coming up for inspection and maybe approaching the trigger to have to pave, and perhaps trying to get that neighborhood to work together where you can have some efficiencies in cost, so it's not each individually. Maybe we can try to help make this happen a little bit more efficiently so it's not a burden for each and every one, or as much of a burden.
Gail again.
I'm sorry, Stephanie. I received this piece of paper. It lists potential ordinance updates and then the requesting parties and such. And number 1 says to clarify the applicability of number of guaranteed unrelated for R4, R3, MF, and such. So am I to understand then that currently most of all of this is applicable to R1, R2, and RP, and now we're going to expand it?
No, actually it's the reverse, because if you take literally what was adopted, even though it was not intended, you could say that a multifamily property, a new apartment building, has to go through group rental, and we've taken a couple through that. That was certainly not the intent. We want to clarify and exempt those from the review.
And does any part of what you potentially might update clarify the duplex to not be a part of this?
At this point, the proposal is to not touch duplexes on occupancy level.
At one point in time in our process, we thought it was somewhat vague, that duplexes were in fact exempt from it. Either A, staff doesn't feel that it's vague now, or I think we should specifically state it.
You're right, we have gone back and forth on that. You and I have had several emails about duplexes, so I think that's a good point.
I have to apologize, I missed the first half hour, but I didn't see anything in the slides that talked about potential resident-only parking, especially right within the first couple blocks of campus where you would want to encourage a high density of students. A certain percentage of the students wouldn't have vehicles, that sort of thing. And wondering what is potentially in the works there.
Well, right now we're focused on adding clarity to the ordinance that was adopted. And as far as a residential parking program, that's a very large scope project. When we have requests come through for maybe designating no parking or alternate parking, council's first question is usually, what does the rest of the block think about it? And they want the feedback. So if there's interest in a parking program like that, then I would say let's hear if a majority are in favor of doing that before we spend time on it.
Okay.
Gail for the third.
Well, I'm sorry, I must be a little slow. On the last sheet of paper, it says other, considering parking permits in the College Hill overlay area. I guess I didn't really hear any discussion on that.
That was what Daryl was just asking about.
Well, Okay.
This list is anything that people commented to us about, not necessarily that that's everything that's being addressed by what I presented.
So my question is, this one doesn't really say whether staff's encouraging or in favor of. Does staff have a
This does
position?
not reflect, yeah, that aspect. Other comments or questions, clarifications? Bruce?
Clarify number 4 on, excuse me. Could you clarify number 4 on the potential ordinance updates that were,
Would you read through, please? I actually don't have it in front
it
of me.
says review applicability when transfer of the property occurs due to death. Should this situation, the intra-relation transfer, be different than others? And I just wanted to clarify, you went over that a little bit,
Yeah.
and I just wanted to clarify, is it apply, your recommendation going to be applied to a death in the family where title transfers to another member of the family by estate purposes, for example? Is that covered in any of your recommendations?
The proposal at this time is that if that's a transfer, whether it's at death or before death of a parent to a child, the occupancy level could remain as is at the 4. But if it's to a nephew, an uncle, or whatever, that's a little bit different situation.
One of the criteria that I've seen in the code that when you try to go to 5 unrelated people, and in the wording of the code for 4 even, has a sprinkler requirement. And that's a extremely costly endeavor. And I don't know how a fire can determine if there's related or unrelated people, but I would like to see that loosened up a little bit if you want to encourage density of the people, students near the campus, and having 5 people potentially. Especially when you got a single-story house with a basement, because the fire code, if you look in there, it talks about over 2 stories when you start to trigger sprinkler requirements, because that's more common sense that it's difficult to get out of a 3-story building, and sprinklers help you do so. So. Thanks.
Anybody else before Bob sits down again? He can always get back up. That's good exercise. All right, well, thank you for coming, listening, providing some comments, and noting perhaps some areas where some additional clarity would be helpful. So thank you. That's exactly what we hope to achieve today. I don't know, Frank, anything else? Come again next week if you like. Yeah. All right, thank you very much.